And I think all the four talks will speak for themselves in terms of how that connection with something called the left and something called Islam is going to happen here. And I'm not going to take up too much time because we have, as you can see, four very fabulous speakers. And I don't want to eat into their time.
Can you switch off your phone so that might help?
It's the one.
You turn off your phone.
You have to when they turn it on the computer. Exactly as that.
Anamika.
Off the Wi-Fi?
Wait, what is it?
It's my phone. No, it's just laptop. I don't know, but I'm glad they found it. Really good.
Is the mic still? Yeah, right. Is the mic still hooked in? The mic is unplugged from the laptop. Was it plugged to the laptop? Wasn't it initially when the video was on? Was it still? So can we unplug the mic? Oh, one of the mics also down. Yeah.
It's the feedback, I guess, from the mic on the laptop.
They said it's going to rain. So far, it doesn't look like it.
They're taking their time.
And your video is
Are we good? So much for trying to save time. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to welcome these four fabulous speakers to New York and to this conference. And thank you very much to Kanchan and Paula for giving us this opportunity. And we're going to just follow the order of talks that are given in the program itself. So Irfan Ahmad will speak first, then Fathima Cader, then Huma, and then Layli. So just to give you the introductions to the speakers that are in your program, just as a quick introduction to them. Irfan Ahmad will be working as a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the study of religious and ethnic diversity starting in June 2017, and until January he was the associate professor of political anthropology at Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. Fathima Cader is a human rights litigator in Toronto. In 2010, Fathima helped coordinate jail support for asylum seekers, including infants, who had been detained upon their arrival in British Columbia from Sri Lanka. And Fathima has written extensively on her work on these and other issues related to Sri Lanka and Muslim identity and war on terror, and we'll hear some of that from her today. Huma's work is focused on the intersections and co-formations of race, religion, caste, gender, sexuality, and national politics in South Asia and South Asian diasporas, centered on intellectual and political activism for social justice. Fathima and Huma will also speak to some of the issues that have been sort of present and absent in our conversations in this conference so far. And last but not least, we will have towards the end. Layli, oh, the very end. Layli Uddin is a social historian of late 19th and 20th century East Bengal in Bangladesh. She recently completed her PhD at Royal Holloway University of London, and she is working right now as a research curator of the British Library 2 Centuries of Indian Print project. So it's my great pleasure to welcome all 4 of them to this conference.
So it is working, the microphone? Okay. So no need to repeat the title. So I'll begin with the chief argument that I want to present here, which is as follows. If, as an international ideology, communism is nationalized from Indochina, South Asia to East Europe, as Benedict Anderson, Hobsbawm, and others contend, so is, I argue, Indian communism. And I show nationalism of Indian communism on 3 issues. The first one is the whole issue of secularism and Hinduism. The second one I want to focus on Urdu. And the third one is in the usage of terms like Hindu Taliban or Muslim Gandhi. Now, one of the things is that Anderson's imagined community was not actually about nationalism. The book is about communism. Nationalism is only an explanation of communism. And in that book, Anderson was following Hobsbawm's suggestion, namely that Marxist movements and states have tended to become national, not only in form, but in substance as well. That is nationalist. So if left is also nationalist, then it follows that the enemy other, which is constitutive of nationalism, is not absent in left either. In Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt devoted 8 pages to what she called leftist anti-Semitism. So what I do here, I bring Anderson and Hannah Arendt to read the Indian left. Okay? So we begin with the first one, which is secularism and Hinduism. Anamika. So this is your turn now, okay? So this is a video, a speech by Bardhan. We had talked about another Bardhan, but this is the Bardhan of Communist Party of India. Okay? So, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah.
एक रथ पर चढ़कर एक पक्ष के नेता उनका चुनाव चिन्ह कमल को लेते हुए और भारतीय जनता पार्टी का ध्वज लहराते हुए देश भर में रथ यात्रा करते हुए घूम रहे हैं। तो ये किस लिए घूम रहे हैं? बीजेपी के लिए वोट बटोरने के लिए? अगला चुनाव अगर आवे तो 88 का 188 किस तरह किया जाए, इस बात पर सोचने के लिए? मैं ये कहता हूं कि उनके सारे ये रंगीन सपना चूर चूर होकर रह जाएंगे, क्योंकि इस देश में बहुसंख्यक हिंदुओं ने धर्मनिरपेक्षता को अपनाया है। अगर आज ये भारत एक धर्मनिरपेक्ष देश के रूप में है, इसका बहुत बड़ा श्रेय इस देश में बसने वाले 85% हिंदुओं को बेशक जाता है। लेकिन वही ताकतें जो हिंदू धर्म के अंदर कठमुल्लापन कायम रखना चाहते हैं, झंडा लहराकर मस्जिदें गिराना चाहते हैं, वही लोग इस देश के अंदर में वर्णाश्रम और जात पात के नाम पर भी जो है तो आज कसमें खा रहे हैं और उसके प्रयत्न कर रहे हैं। इनके चेहरों
Now, A.V. Bardhan was, of course, a very well-known communist leader. He also served as General Secretary of CPI. He died in late 2015 or 2016. So, and this was a speech which was made in Patna at a rally which was supposed to be the gathering of all secular parties against BJP. Now, if India is a secular country, as Bardhan says, because 85% Hindus population, Now, of course, this statement can mean many things, okay? The first, that the non-Hindu population has nothing to do with secularism. Regionally speaking, it can mean that Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, because the majority population is not Hindu, so they cannot be secular. Internationally, it can mean, much like Christianity, Hinduism does make a separation between the spiritual and the temporal, and therefore, by virtue of that, it is secular. Now, this exactly is the argument which Hindutva makes, that secularism is inherent to Hinduism, or India is secular precisely because of majority of population is Hindu. So there is one aspect of left that I wanted to speak about. Now the second one, this is a pamphlet which Sitaram Yechuri of CPM published in 1993, and it was titled Pseudo-Hinduism Exposed, Saffron Brigades, Myths and Reality. Yechuri literally copied Uddin, and he wrote, I quote, at the outset, and this is on page 1, at the outset it must be emphasized that India is a secular country because the predominant majority of Hindus embraced secularism. And he goes on, a constitution that was drafted by a predominant Hindu majority of the Constituent Assembly, a constitution that continues to be defended by Hindus, end of quote. Now, neither Uddin nor Yechuri tell us why the word secularism was inserted in constitution only in 1976 or 1977. According to Yechuri, mobilization of Hindu sentiment by RSS is against the vast diversity and majority of Hindu opinion, which has been guided more by what he calls Vivekananda and Adi Shankara than by Golwalkar. And then he cites a passage from the Gita. That quote is followed by his own conclusion, which is, whatever be the color of the cow, the milk is always white. Now, Yechuri describes destruction of Babri Masjid as vandalism, and accuses Saffron Brigade of supporting caste inequalities. In such support, Yechuri saw throwing us all back into what he calls medieval barbarism. Yechuri's choice of the phrase medieval barbarism is not innocent. He could have also said ancient barbarism. In 1993, Yechuri wrote another pamphlet which was called What is Hindu Rashtra? Okay? While describing the notion of Hindu Rashtra as fascist, Yechuri criticized Dharm Sansad and VHP, which called India's constitution un-Hindu and non-Hindu. What is interesting is that Yechuri's entire criticism itself is based on a prior notion of what is Hinduism and what is true Hinduism. Okay, so he says, actually there is a subtitle in the pamphlet which is called Hijacking Hinduism. Okay, in Yechuri's view, RSS agenda has nothing to do with religion. They are enemies of the humanistic content of Hinduism itself. But this understanding of religion, Yechuri doesn't extend when he's writing about other religions. So he says the fact that Islamic Bangladesh separated from Muslim Pakistan, okay, then he gives that a quote, but the whole point is, was Bangladeshi movement for autonomy or independence grounded in religion or in Islam? But he's attributing it, okay? The last section of the pamphlet is called Muslim fundamentalism. He doesn't use the term fundamentalism about Hindus, it is only about Muslims. And there is a quote, Maududi is to the Jamaat what Golwalkar is to the RSS. The similarity of their political project and role is indeed remarkable. Just as Hitler was a hero for Golwalkar, so was Hitler for Maududi. End of quote. Now, I have done some archival and historical work on Maududi. There is no basis to make this claim. Okay, but he does it. And this is, in the Indian context, itself born out of logic of equalization, which in itself is a nationalist requirement, as I would say. Interesting thing is, Yechuri concluded his pamphlet as follows, and I quote, all patriots who have not sold their conscience to the enemies of the nation have to rise as one man to meet this fascist challenge, end of quote. A Marxist thus concluded not by invoking the enemy of the people, but enemy of the nation. Okay? Also consider this one. This is from the manifesto of 1996, CPIML, which is more radical than CPM. It grounds its appeal as follows: brothers and sisters, CPIML appeals to every honest and nation-loving, Desh-Bhakt Indian citizen to come under the flag of national independence, secularism, and economic and social justice. Now, the fact that pursuit of socialism is no more on the agenda of Communist Party need not be stressed, even though it does occur in Constitution. Okay? So this is one aspect. The other one I wanted to talk about is this whole idea of Urdu jihad. So what we hear today about love jihad, actually it was already prefigured by a Marxist, and that might surprise some of you. Namwar Singh is quite a heavy name in Hindi literature. He retired as a professor of Hindi at JNU. In 1959, he also contested election from CPI, and I think he lost. Okay. He also served as president of All India Progressive Writers Association. In 1986, he wrote an article which was called Basi Bhat Mein Khuda Ka Saja, and I translated it, God's partnership in the stale rice. And another translation which was God's partnership in the rice left over from the previous night. But that was bad, okay? So, in this article, his whole point is, this was in relation to the demand in UP that Urdu should be accorded second official language. And he says that Urdu is a language connected with separatism and partition, and therefore Urdu speakers should not have any claim for Urdu in India. In 1995, the same Namwar Singh, in a seminar when historian Shahid Amin suggested that there should be overcoming of distance between Hindi and Urdu, he actually supported the whole slogan of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. According to Kuldeep Kumar, who wrote a piece about Singh, he says that we need to recognize that Hindus and Muslims are different, not only in terms of religion, but that they also represent two different cultures and nationalities. This is Namwar Singh. Now one wonders what kind of Marxist understanding drove Namwar Singh to come to such a judgment. To quote the greatest linguist, you know who I mean? Stalin. Okay? He said that language belongs neither to superstructure nor to base structure. But nonetheless, this is his Marxist understanding. So I'm just trying to understand Singh's stand stems less from his commitment to Marxism and more from his commitment to or identification with a particular community in which this whole language thing is placed. In 1992, CPIML, which is another breakaway group from CPM, they launched a front which was called Inqalabi Muslim Conference. Now this in itself is very interesting because there is nothing called Inqalabi Hindu Conference. Okay? So why do you need this Inqalabi Muslim Conference? This is the document. Now this was established to fight for secular India in the face of threats to the integrity and unity of the nation. And Comrade Vinod Mishra, in that meeting, he said, and this is very interesting, we say that you, aapko, you have to protect your identity. And if you want that Urdu should get its legitimate position, I say that our party supports your demand. Regarding personal law, as far as I know, there are talks about reform in your community. Now, throughout the talk, he assumes that Muslims are they, and he is not definitely one of them. So the question is, which community does Mishra himself or his party represent? Now, the final, in one point, I want to talk about this idea of Hindu Taliban, okay, and that is where I will conclude. So, since the rise of Taliban in the Indian left, the term Hindu Taliban became a trope to criticize certain undesirable practices But the key question here is to call a given practice among Hindus an example of Hindu Taliban means that undesirable practice derives its power not from Hindu culture but from Muslim, because Muslim culture becomes the reference point in relation to which the practice among Hindus find meaning and explanation. And this is very similar to Benjamin Barber's argument in Jihad versus Macworld, where he says that he uses jihad as a shorthand for atavistic politics of all time, but the essential jihad is located in Islam, okay? And due to centrality of Islam as the locus of so-called atavistic politics, especially after 9/11, both in India as well as the West, the reverse is never followed, meaning that of course there have been also, for example, violent tradition in religions other than Islam, but that is never talked about. Now the second speech of Uddin, if you remember, he also says कि Hindu धर्म में जो कटमुल्लापन है. Now कटमुल्लापन, so mulla is an Urdu word, okay, which means that is superstition or whatever, rigidity. But he could have used other words as well, right? And Hindi is not short of those words. So it is very similar to like Modi describing Rahul Gandhi as Shahzada, as if there is nothing called Yuvraj. Okay? So this kind of, now when Sri Ram Sena attacked these Valentine's Day functions, Brinda Karat tweeted that actually Sri Ram Sena people are twin Taliban. Okay? So, and this famous article which was, so the whole point here is that Kapoor framed the issue in a way that Modi and RSS become mere derivatives of the original, which is Islam and then Taliban. So it is, I mean, of course it is, I don't have much time to go into detail, but these were three issues through which I wanted to say that how the Indian left adopts the nationalist language in its own discourse. Thank you.
Next we have Fathima Cader, speaking about wars of terror, linkages from North America to Sri Lanka and back.
So thank you, Sadia, and thank you, New York University, for the kind invitation to be here. It's really an honor to be on a panel with these speakers, in particular, and to think about Islam in like really discordant ways, in ways that I'm excited to explore. And so linkages. As Sadia mentioned, I live and I practice law in Toronto, which rests on the territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Putin, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And it's with a lot of gratitude that I'm here today in New York City on the territories of 10 different Iroquois nations. And I want to signal that at the outset, right? Because at an obvious level, I had to cross the colonial border to get here. And when I think about what it means now to be Muslim, to be living under Trump, to be coming up against this border in ever thornier ways, is with a deeper sense of gratitude for the ways in which indigenous communities and nations and peoples have resisted these borders across Turtle Island since the creation of these countries. And obviously, to speak about South Asia, and to speak about South Asia specifically in North America, is to signal, unintentionally or not, willingly or not, to signal to borders, whether those are literal borders in the subcontinent, or the no less real borders of things like caste and religion and language. So all of this to say that today, when I talk about the intercontinental mappings of the war on terror, it is very much in the spirit of solidarity with decolonial struggles here. And to think about terror in the ways in which it's been foundational to the creation and the ongoing existence of Canada and the US. And so one of the ways in which terror has manifested is that last month at approximately 8 p.m. On January 29th, a 27-year-old by the name of Alexander walked into a mosque in Quebec City and commenced a mass shooting of the worshippers who were there. So it was Isha time, so it was a nighttime prayer, and he killed 6 people. And their names are A-zadi and Sufyan. Khalid Al-Qasimi, Ibrahimi buried. Mamadou buried Abdul Karim Hassan and Abu Bakr Zabti. So at least 11 other people were injured that night, and the victims ranged in age from about 35 to 70 years old. One of the things that's really interesting about that attack is that when the police arrived, the first person they arrested was someone who was actually performing first aid on one of the victims, himself a young student who had been there for prayers. And I'm going to say his name. I thought maybe I wouldn't say his name, but I'm going to, because his name is Muhammad Cader, and he has been actually misidentified in mainstream media as a suspect because of that arrest, even though he was actually one of the would-be victims in that attack. And so we find ourselves in a time where white supremacist logic reigns so supreme that even when we have an attack on a mosque, even when a white supremacist walks into a mosque and attempts to kill all of the people there, it is Muslims who are classified as a suspect. And of course, this was never about logic. We can think forward ahead then to the ways in which Trump has relied or used this attack as justification for his Muslim ban, right? So this ban that is supposed to prevent the entry of Muslims from certain countries into the US was somehow justified by an attack that targeted Muslims and that was committed by someone who would not have been affected by the Muslim ban. And I remember exactly where I was when the news broke. Like, there was something about that weekend, like the days preceding, that had felt quite surreal. There was a way in which I think I've been like, sort of in the last few months, kind of turtling away from sort of the really terrible news that's been unfolding. But there was that weekend that just a sense of like, we're waiting for our slaughter. Like, we are waiting for really, really bleak times. And it seems like when you say that out loud, it sounds unreal. It sounds, like really far-fetched. And yet we have precedents for exactly these kinds of state-sponsored and racialized mass violence in Canada, for example. And I will talk about Canada specifically because I'm cognizant I'm speaking to an American audience that may want to mythologize the ways in which Canada has approached issues of diversity or even like healthcare. And so some of the precedents that I want to point to are, for example, Canada's own use of slave labor in the very early stages, and the ways then in the ways in which in the early 1900s it actually banned black immigration from the U.S. to Canada. So black immigrants who were attempting to flee really dangerous levels of violence and racism in the U.S. were prohibited from entering Canada, even as Canada was simultaneously allowing the KKK entry into Canada, such that we've had a history in Canada of the KKK from the 1920s onwards. So that's one example. Another example is, for example, Canada's use of residential schools. So these were like the forced abduction of Indigenous children from their homes and their communities, and thousands upon thousands of children were killed and assaulted over the subsequent years. The last residential school closed in the 1990s. We can think about the internment camps during World War II that were created in BC to house, to intern Japanese Canadians. And also during World War II, when Canada rejected the entry of Jewish refugees, who we know, like we have documented this, were returned to Nazi Germany, where they were all killed. So these are examples of the ways in which racialized and colonial violence has operated, and these are the precedents on which we can rely. So to the extent that the fears that I know that I and many others in this room feel, those fears are grounded in reality, in a history that we know. So what felt surreal rather about the weekend was just the sense that you continue living, you continue waiting for this thing that for a future that already feels very familiar. And so then as this happens, this news breaks of this attack in Quebec City. And what it really, I think the reason it hit me was not only the obvious reasons of like my family goes to mosques. I could have been any one of my brothers, my siblings, but also specifically how it reminded me of a recent trip to Sri Lanka. And so the picture behind me is one of a mosque in Kathmandu. This is the Mira Juma Masjid. Kathmandu is a large city in the eastern province of Sri Lanka. And so for folks who aren't familiar with Sri Lankan politics, it's a regional sort of situation. And I've been here in the past, I think 2 years ago, where I spoke a little bit about like Muslim political relations in Sri Lanka and the ways in which they're deeply regional. So the eastern province is one where there's a lot, there are large Tamil and Muslim communities. And to even speak about those communities as distinct is a very iffy sort of subject, or identification politics anyway. And so in this mosque, on August 3rd in 1990, again during Isha prayers, Tamil Tigers raided this mosque and one other smaller mosque in the city that night, killing 147 people. There had been other attacks in mosques in the eastern province in the preceding weeks, but none to this scope. And at that time, Kathmandu had a population of about 60,000 people, the vast majority of whom were Muslim. Following this attack in October of that year, the LTTE would evict all Muslims from Jaffna, so very much the heart of Tamil separatism in Sri Lanka, with an eye to establishing purity as it pursued its project of Elam, of a separate Tamil state in Sri Lanka. And this despite the fact that there had been Muslims, and there continues to be Muslims, who were quite supportive of the separatist project in Sri Lanka, including Muslims who had joined and fought with the LTTE. So the exact reasons for the LTTE's massacre in Kathmandu in particular remain unknown. But it proves it was certainly provided like a critical sort of splintering moment in the ways in which Muslims started to, in the East anyway, started to relate to the Tamil separatist movement. And I want to be absolutely clear here that I don't want to conflate the LTTE with white supremacy in the US. Nor do and I remain also unconvinced that calling the LTTE a terrorist group in the way that has been formally classified by, for example, Canada, remains unhelpful. But what I do want to signal at a really basic sort of point is the ways in which mosques have become sites, and long have been sites, of extreme vulnerability for Muslims. Even as, in the contemporary moment, we find that there are also sites of extreme surveillance, especially in North America. With this mosque, I think walking into this mosque for the first time in October was really intense, because also what those holes that you see, or the pockmarks that you see, are the bullet holes from 1990. So in the following 30 years, and 3 decades that continued, the decision was made to continue to sort of retain those marks. And so it's, like for folks who are familiar with mosques, what we're looking at then is the direction of Qibla, like when you're facing prayer. So what would have happened is all of the worshippers would have been facing that particular wall when the Tigers came in. They would have been shot in the back. And that wall then is the wall to which people continue to direct their prayer. So there's a sense in which faith becomes something that is so seeped in blood. And there's also then a question around the memorialization that happens in and around mosques. And another way that that's manifested is this is outside the mosque, and outside also the second mosque, the Fauzi Mosque in Kathmandu, and it's a plaque with all of the names of the victims who died that night, as well a plaque, like the plaque on my left-hand side is a denunciation of the Tigers. This was actually quite contested by Muslims in Kathmandu. There was a lot of really fierce debate as to whether or not to memorialize it in this way, but it stands there now. But meanwhile, as I've spoken at this particular conference 2 years ago, we're seeing a surge in liberal claims that Kathmandu in particular is being Arabized and is being radicalized, as sourced through one migrant work in the Middle East. So a lot of Sri Lanka's GDP relies on domestic workers and laborers working in Saudi Arabia, for example, and in other parts of the Gulf. So the thesis is that people go off to work where they're massively exploited. We know people being killed doing migrant work in the Gulf, somehow come back radicalized, and sort of the metaphor of infection is quite overt. And then how is this demonstrated? It's demonstrated through the ways in which women dress. And so there's really serious concern about the fact that there are hijabs and niqabs and there are thobes and there are beards readily present in Kathmandu. I mean, like, sort of anecdotally, like when I was in the Eastern Province in October, one of the things that was also really quite interesting to watch was the ways in which, separate of like all these anxieties about Muslim women's dress in particular, schools that were now emerging, or like teachers who were teaching in schools, women in particular, were being asked to wear specifically white saris. And the rationale behind this was that it was how you demonstrated modesty, and it was becoming a uniform. It was enforced as a uniform in order to protect the modesty of Tamil women in the Eastern Coast. And yet that's never talked about in any sort of like related terms to the ways in which women's clothes are indicative of like state desires, of community desires, in a way that has nothing to do necessarily with terrorism. But rather, like, I would be more interested in hearing about, solidarities, or like women working with each other across, and that work is already happening across these kinds of really facile differences, where women's dress becomes indicative of these larger questions of terrorism. And obviously there's been, like, not maybe obviously, but to me obviously and quite frustratingly, there's been a very limited analysis, an anti-capitalist analysis of the ways in which these workers are being exploited, and the ways in which the state, even as it denounces Saudi Arabia for being backwards, etc., relies on the continuing exploitation of these workers. So it's easier here to slot Sri Lanka's Muslims into a rigidly sort of prescriptive war on terror rhetoric of a hostile Muslim, unanimous, homogenized other world than it is to think about Sri Lanka's complicity in really mundane blows of capital. But, notwithstanding all of that, the thesis around the radicalization of Muslims is very popular in Sri Lanka. And one of the ways that this has become really dangerous is post-war now we're seeing a lot of attacks on Muslim communities in Sri Lanka by Buddhist monks. And so the picture behind me is the aftermath of an attack in July 2014 in Alutkama by the BBS, the Bodha Bala Sena. They were led by monks, and they attacked a number of, this town, Alutkama, which is mostly Muslim. They attacked homes, businesses, and mosques, and they killed 3 people in the process. And I would argue that the logic of the BBS more closely mimics the white supremacist logic that we see in the US than does the LTTE, if only because it's state-sponsored, or rather the state benefits from it. And it also underscores that in Sri Lanka, the limited usefulness of Muslims claiming patriotism, which is something that really happened a lot around the war. So again, it's so regional that Muslims in the East might have had a very complicated relationship with Tamil separatism, but Muslims in the center or in the South are much more likely sometimes to claim, for example, to fight in the Sri Lankan army. And yet we're seeing that isn't protection. And so to me, like, the obvious thing then for those who are working on issues of Islamophobia in this moment, in the Sri Lankan context, is that our work has to remain attentive to the repression of both Tamils and Muslims in Sri Lanka, and the ongoing militarization and colonization of the East and the North, and the slippage of counter-terrorist rhetorics as they've been used against Tamils and are now being used against Muslims, and the global resonances of these sort of terror-fixated logics. Which brings me back to Canada. So this is last week, like basically around the corner from where I work, and at a mosque in Toronto. So there was this demo. It's like Friday. There's Jummah prayers, and there's this demo of like no Islam, whatever that means, outside a mosque. So it's downtown Toronto, like the intersection of Dundas and Yonge. And I was like, I went off to, be involved. I don't know. It was like by the time I arrived, they'd already left. But what they'd done was just move to another mosque. And so there's this way in which people are just like really public about, their hatreds, and that even after, like less than 3 weeks after there had been open fire on a mosque, people are willing to like have these kinds of demos outside a mosque, another mosque in Toronto. And this followed also a really vile sort of event organized by Ezra Levant, where it was just like full of hate speech, and where former Canadian politicians and would-be Canadian politicians were present and spoke. So it's like, as much as it might seem like fringe stuff that's happening, it's also deeply ingrained. And so I just want to end with like, what does that mean then for leftists who want to mobilize against the ways in which mosques are like really unsafe for Muslims? It has to be tied to a practice or analysis that understands that mosques have always been unsafe for Muslims. And that I think is really difficult to think about. Mosques are deeply securitized spaces. Like when I think about mosques in Toronto, these are spaces that have been hugely and are hugely surveilled, where practices around informant or entrapment are just par for the course. These are things that like people joke about. That's how deeply ingrained they are. That has always been an issue of safety and of danger for Muslims who have been attending these mosques. And so one of the responses to attacks like these or demos like these is that we should ask for more security from the police. We should ask for the state to be more present in our mosques. And I would suggest that isn't really, that may not be the most helpful thing. And I understand like where it comes from, like the place of fear is one I like appreciate deeply. But again, if we're going to think about one, like strategically, whether that helps in the long run or what that means, or what that suggests about the ways in which we want to posit ourselves as citizens, as patriots, and the limited usefulness of that, but also too the ways in which if we're on the one hand, denouncing police violence against, for example, and overlapping communities of like Black people or Black Muslims, what does it mean to ask for protection from the very same people that we're afraid of? And so again, I just close with like the thing that I said earlier, which is it has to come from a place of solidarity and a willingness to be like really in solidarity with folks that we might not otherwise see ourselves in connection with. And so for me again, it comes down to like, what does it mean as Muslims or as immigrants or as children of immigrants in North America to do this work in solidarity with Indigenous communities who have long been facing a lot of this violence for centuries.
Quick change in the program. Layli Uddin will be speaking next and Huma will be speaking last for logistical reasons. And Layli will be speaking about Maulana Bhashani, the great Maulana of once East Pakistan and East Bengal.
So a quick round of thanks to Dina and Sadia and NYU for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the figure who I've worked on for the last, sorry, I'm going to start with a video. I'm going to talk about a figure who I've worked on for the last 8 years, Maulana Bhashani. And it feels, for a man who has produced no text of his own, it feels almost criminal to begin without sort of seeing or hearing him for a while. So let me just start with this. This is a rally that took place just 2 weeks before the war began itself in Lanka. I suspect that many of us, can you not hear me? Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Right, okay. This is tricky. I suspect that many of us in the audience here are fairly familiar with Maulana Bhashani, and I don't hold you responsible, because it does beg the question that who gets remembered and who doesn't in our histories, and in what spaces or contexts or audiences does it become urgent to recover and remember those who have been forgotten. So let us take, for example, Sunil Kilnani's recent book, Incarnation. If you read the book and look at the map in which he plots the 50 most influential lives, you would think that apart from a few Badroloki Bengalis, that the whole of East Bengal has not produced figures of any relevance, or anyone whose reach could extend beyond the familiar world. So in other words, irrelevant to our understanding of the ebbs and flows of major social, political, and intellectual changes in the subcontinent or to global political history. The same can be said for Sindh or Balochistan as well. So the actors and sites of productions of history are not neutral. It determines the kind of histories we write, and it also determines those who are served by these histories. However, if we allowed others to plot the map, who saw, lived, and experienced our world differently, then another set of figures would emerge, such as that of Maulana Bhashani, also known as the Red Maulana. Bhashani, who lived from 1880 to 1976, was a powerful Sufi peer, a politician, peasant, labor leader, who acquired prominence in the region of East Bengal and beyond over the colonial and post-colonial period for a number of reasons, namely for his formidable skills in mass mobilization of subaltern constituencies against various regimes in a united Pakistan up to 1971, and then in Bangladesh in the struggle to acquire dignity, justice, and equality. The epithet Red Maulana was a result of his unlikely leadership of radical left-wing and progressive factions, especially the National Awami Party of Pakistan. So despite Bhashani not meriting adequate or serious attention from Western academia, or being a figure of scorn and ridicule in archives, derided for his rusticity, his illiteracy, and Maulana-ness, he has been remembered on different terms. If you Google WAC, Maulana Bhashani, you will see the term Majloom Jonaneta, leader of the oppressed, come up. So I want to think about why Bhashani ought to be remembered today, and especially for the times that we live in today. And the answer, strangely enough, rests partially in why Beyonce saw it fit to project Malcolm X and Black Panthers in her performance on her show of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. It is the discomfort that a figure like Bhashani produced within those in power, but also amongst those that he attempted to organize. Bhashani was a man pilloried by the establishment, described as a prophet of violence, the Pakistani Ayatollah Kashani, a fire eater, a rustic, illiterate, and dangerous fool, Kafir and Hanuman, largely because of his unceasing and unsparing attacks on those who held power for their various neglects and failures, for his creative and unorthodox politics which brought different life worlds, traditions, and politics together, and for his relationships with subaltern constituencies. So what I want to discuss today is the discomfort that Maulana Bhashani produced within his own constituencies. And this discomfort comes from his challenge of their complacency, their silence, and fear of freedom. I describe this politics as the fragments of a pedagogy of the press, fragments because Bhashani is not producing text here. And my analysis here borrows heavily from the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. And before I describe what the elements of this pedagogy is, I should attempt to answer what the relevance of one is, which sprang under different historical, material, geographical conditions to us today. What is the relevance of this pedagogy today? So Bhashani described oppression as a state of being omanj, inhuman, non-human, being denied your humanity. So if we can agree that oppression is an act of dehumanization, of being made to feel less human, especially by those in power, then we can suggest that the current treatment of the sick, the definitely able, working class families whose benefits are stripped from them, of workers who are forced to work long hours on low pay and 0-hour contracts, the harassment and detention of racial communities and Muslims by law enforcement and security services, and the hostile treatment of vulnerable migrants and refugees is nothing other than to make them feel less human. Under these circumstances, a pedagogy of the oppressed becomes imperative, a pedagogy that strives towards the humanization of all. So there are three elements that I'm going to outline in Bhashani's pedagogy, and the first element was Bhashani's legitimization of anger as a powerful and transformative political emotion. Bhashani, dismissed by his opponents as an unprecedented rabble-rouser, or simply an agitator, even by those within his party, explained his reasons for doing so. In the early 20th century in colonial Bengal, Bhashani led a campaign against the Maharaja of Shantosh, North Dhaka, against the oppressive rent rates and land seizures from poor peasants. When asked by when asked by the Zamindar as to why Bhashani was against him, Bhashani said, quote, you would not recognize me and treat me as an equal unless I agitate and create trouble for you, end quote. Anger for Bhashani was one of the key signs of critical consciousness, people recognizing their dehumanized state by speaking it, by naming it, and thus taking the first steps towards recovering their humanity. In 1954, during the period of the first provincial elections in East Pakistan, at one of the election rallies in one of the small towns in North Bengal, a young Fazle Khuda was left awestruck by Bhashani's belligerent speech, which was directed at a daroga present. In his recollection, Fazle Khuda states, quote, "Our experience of them, the police, was as jallads, devils. If they wanted, they could arrest anyone and beat them. We understood for the first time then that the police were there to help and not rule over us. They worked for us." End quote. Bhashani's irreverence, or rather his defiance of authority, which we see in the picture above, and that was in 1969, where he's defying one of the laws which prohibits public assembly. So Bhashani's irreverence, or rather his defiance of authority, was the attempt to restore power and authority to those who he argued were the true sovereigns, the people. And why is this important today? Today, the government silences and delegitimizes anger, and the anger of certain groups in particular in our politics, conflating it with violence and extremism, repressing political protests and demonstrations, however, and by continuing to do so, making us feel less free and more impressed. But Bhashani's pedagogy was not built on anger alone. He regarded dialogue as integral to working towards freedom and humanization. Dialogue signified a fuller embrace of the world and belonging to it. He brought workers and peasants into conversations from which they had been excluded from by those in power. He did this in their spaces, using their own languages, registers of understanding, and interpretive frameworks. He used festivals, boat tours to remote communities, and spiritual oaths to dialogue on issues of socialism, internationalism, and democracy. In 1957, when the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Sohrabadi, a member of Bhashani's own party, reaffirmed his commitment to bilateral and multilateral security agreements, SEATO, Baghdad Pact, reneging on the party's initial promises, securing the support of middle-class students and urban intelligentsia, Bhashani organized a village mela as part of the party council convention to draw in the marginalized and destitute classes, and he used festival gates, music, arts, and lectures to convey messages of friendship, cooperation, and solidarity with Afro-Asian bloc. These are some of the pictures of the mela itself. For example, one of the striking things of the mela was that over 50 to 100 gates were set up, which those attending the festivals passed by. Each of these gates had the names of various local, national, and international leaders emblazoned on them, like Mao, Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, Subhash Bose, Rumi, Bernard Shaw, Haji Shariatullah, Jinnah, and the Prophet. There was no attempt made to separate these individuals or endow ornamental and hierarchical privilege on the basis of religion, nation, language, or geography. Rather, what was being asked of the peasants and workers, for whom most of the names, other than that of the Prophet and Jinnah and a handful of others, were unfamiliar, was to reflect on the connections and unities between the different geographies, languages, traditions, practices, and ideas. When Bhashani spoke to the peasants and workers at the height of the unrest in the 1960s and described them as the Shorbohara, the proletariat, he did not define them by their lack, but by their ubiquitous presence across different geographies, civilizations, and era, possessing the power to change the course of history. The Shorboharas were the Bani Israelis in ancient Egypt, the Sicilian slaves who revolted against the Roman Empire, the Russian, European, Asian peasants, and workers of the modern age, working to establish an oppressive-less society. By inviting working class communities to reflect, speak, and dialogue using familiar language, registers of understanding, and framework, Bhashani demonstrated that humanity was not an abstract or complex concept, but one that was demonstrable and rooted. And the third, and perhaps the most important element in Bhashani's pedagogy, was action. Action that built on reflection and sought to transform the situation of those oppressed. However, for Bhashani, the endeavor for striving for full humanity was a collective one, achieved only through horizontal forms of solidarity and cooperation with others. Thus, in 1957, Bhashani formed the National Awami Party in a united Pakistan, a coalition of left-leaning progressives, Marxists, and religious followers, causing much alarm to the Pakistani state, with its declared program of provincial autonomy, land reform, labor rights, industrialization, democratization, and an independent foreign policy and cooperation with the Afro-Asia bloc. Bhashani was unconcerned with the epithet of Maulana that was given to him. In response to a question of whether he was a communist or Maulana by a journalist, Maulana Bhashani replied, quote, "If you think that my life and my thinking matches with that of a communist, then that is neither a matter of joy or sadness. If you too join hands with the enemies of equality, friendship, and freedom, then there is no escape for you from my hands, none of you. However, if it fits with my ideas, and if anyone wants to take part in the struggle, I will take him delightedly into my embrace. Is the hunger only in the stomach of communists? Are they the only ones demanding medicines for the ill, homes for the homeless, and education for those deprived of education? Queen Elizabeth, stricken with hunger, would also want food. And we call her a communist. If an innocent child is hungry, he will cry, want food. But you will call the one who makes that demand for food a communist? Unquote." In the 1960s, Bhashani innovated with a spiritual oath that his religious followers signed up to. This is the Bayah, the oath of allegiance. So beyond the usual articles of faith in God, the Prophet, and the Sufi peer itself, he added an extra thing. He added the pledge to establish socialism, to end imperialism, feudalism, and capitalism, and he made it a material transaction. Usually bayahs are offered through transference of a sort of a handshake or through touching the document. Bhashani makes it a material transaction. The oath, I argue, was to make a Marxist out of the disciple of the Marxist disciple, as he brought the Marxists into the mosques. Their common purpose had not only made both groups acceptable to each other, but also endowed both with an equal standing and the right to enter in the same space and participate in a shared language. The religious secular binary was not, Bhashani demonstrated, an important or even a real impediment of striving towards humane and emancipatory politics of justice, dignity, equality, or the humanization and the liberation of people. Bhashani's pedagogy is not necessarily an original or really a mind-blowing one in some ways. Actually, I'm sure it appears to most an intuitive one, a fairly intuitive one. But that is the reason why perhaps it's radical. That the struggle for humanity, though complex and embedded in questions of class, race, religion, is not an impossible one. It requires us to shake out of our silence and fear of the oppressor, as well as of our own freedom, to listen, to reflect, to speak, to act, to be creative, and join hands with others. And he was a Red Maulana for that reason. I'll leave you with a poem of his. Thank you.
Rounding off